Okay, I think I hit record. Okay, so we are going to go over the causes of World War II and the rise of Hitler. I'm going to go pretty fast because there's no one waiting to take notes, and it's a video, so you can pause it. The PowerPoint will be posted along with the video on the Schoology page, so you can reference back to that as well. Okay, this is a point where I'd usually ask you to tell me this information, but obviously that's not going to work. Okay, so what was the Treaty of Versailles? It, one, officially ended World War I. It was the thing that was like, okay, we've signed this, it's over. It also laid out Germany's punishment, since Germany was the country that surrendered at the end of World War I. They had four really big punishments. One, they had to pay billions of dollars in reparations. Two, they had to assume blame for World War I, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but that was a huge problem for their honor. Three, they had to give up their colonies, which was, the primary way that they made money. So that's a really big problem. And they had to have no standing army, basically meaning that the other European countries did this thing to screw them all over, but took away their military so that their military couldn't, so that way Germany couldn't turn around and then go fight them. So they punished them severely and then gave them no way of fighting back. That's the idea. We're going to talk about the consequences of World War I in Europe in three different categories: economic, political, and cultural. I don't think the slides actually go in this order, which is super inconvenient. So let's talk about political consequences. What caused World War I? Basically a bunch of alliances, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so some of the consequences were a lot of the empires were gone, as you can see in this like overly stretched out map. The Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire were gone. Germany was still kind of around, but the Austrian-Hungarian and the Ottoman Empire, which isn't in this map, were totally broken down. And they were replaced with nation states, which basically means smaller countries that were forced to be democratic. So a bunch of little small countries. This was a problem because the people didn't choose to be democratic. Now, in the US of A, we think of democracy as like a godsend. Like we think of it as like the best thing ever. Like who doesn't want to be in a democracy? The thing is, as in history, as in life, no one wants anything they're forced into. No one wants to be forced into having anything. People like the choice. Nothing works if you're forced into it. So forcing people to have a democracy doesn't work. They don't want it. The other major issue with the way they broke up all these nations is that they didn't really pay attention to religious or ethnic groups and would force like enemy groups together into one country, split people off from their families, things like that. Which, if you remember the scramble for Africa, that's very similar. Europeans be Europeans, I guess. Okay, next slide. Economic consequences. So all European nations were in massive debt after the war, especially Germany, but everyone was. Their countries had been destroyed by the war. It's kind of hard for us in the US to comprehend this since we haven't had a war fought on our soil truly since the Civil War. But like cities were burned down, factories were destroyed, people's homes were gone. So all of this infrastructure was gone. Then suddenly a whole generation of young men were killed in the war. So families didn't have their primary breadwinner anymore. And countries had to go into huge debt to afford the war in the first place. So countries were in debt. They had no infrastructure and were lost a bunch of their male population, which at the time meant basically no economy. So all of this sucked across all of Europe. Germany then had it even worse because they had to pay $55 billion in reparations. So before World War I, Germany was one of the leading nations in the world. It was one of the most powerful nations in the entire world. Now, Germany owed everyone else money. Okay, next slide. Cultural consequences. Okay, so before the war, everyone was pretty optimistic. This is a painting. It's pointillism that is pretty representative of how people viewed life before the war. Industry was happening. There was a rising middle class. People were being educated. There was enlightenment. Life overall was improving. So this very scenic scene by the river, by a French river, very idyllic, very idyllic. Yeah, that's the word. It's very peaceful, very nice. This is how people felt about the world before World War I. Here's how people felt about the world after. Now, for those who may not know, this is a urinal, which is, if you've never been in a boys' bathroom, a urinal is like, this is like upside down. So usually it's on its back. So the part that's on the ground would be attached to the wall, and then you pee into it. That's why boys' bathroom lines move so freaking fast. And this is the kind of art that was popular after World War II. And you might be like, I'm sorry, that's not art. It's not. People were that pessimistic. Basically, this artist, pretty sure it's Marcel Duchamp, he was like, yeah, why would I bother making these beautiful paintings if it doesn't represent the world? After World War I, people was like, the world doesn't make sense. That war was stupid. Thousands of people died. What's the point of anything? What's the point of art? Why can't this urinal on its side be art? So he literally sold this urinal to the art museum. Like, this is a picture of it. So it was like a physical, like, kind of sculpture, but he really just took it off someone's wall. So after World War I, people were pessimistic. Everything was destroyed. The war was fought for no reason. No one believed in government. People just like didn't believe in things anymore. They didn't even believe in art. Okay, and the next slide. So let's focus in on Germany specifically. Politically, Germany became the Weimar Republic, which is the government that the Allied powers forced them in. No, the Alliance powers? The other team forced them into. It was a forced democracy, which means, things like individual rights, women's votes, all those things we think are good. But Germany hated it because they didn't choose it. They did not choose a democracy. The people who beat them, their enemies, forced this government onto them. Of course they're pissed. Of course they hate it. They also hate it because they blame that government for not fixing all of their economic problems. Which leads us to the economic problems, reparations and inflation. Germany has to pay all of that reparation to other countries. And so they do this thing where they flood their economy with more cash, which is called inflation. Now, the video notes explain this much better than I can. But basically, let's go back to the apples example. If you have one apple in the entire world, that apple's going to be worth a lot. But if you suddenly have 100 apples, that one apple isn't worth as much anymore, right? So if you are a person in Germany and you have a savings account of, like, let's say $10,000, and suddenly the German government just prints off a crap ton of money, which in their mind they thought would fix the problem. Like, no one has cash, we'll just print more. So if the government's just printing off all this money, suddenly that money you have in your bank account is worthless. So there's stories of people having to like pull out their entire life savings and retirement funds just to buy some tomatoes at the grocery store. As you can imagine, all this results in a culture of anger, unhappiness, and embarrassment. The Treaty of Versailles is undeniably unfair. Everyone in Europe hates them, and they're not loyal to their government. Also, their economy sucks. Everything sucks in Germany. In conclusion. So now let's turn to Hitler. The beginnings. He was born in the 1880s in Austria to a lower middle class family. So he wasn't even German. He was born in Austria. His life goal was to become an artist. The two paintings on the side are paintings he made. However, I guess those paintings seem excellent to me, but I guess he wasn't good enough. So he got rejected from 3 different art schools. No one would take him. So his entire life purpose was rejected. So he really struggles with purpose. Then World War I starts. And Germany is like, hey, anyone in Austria want to join our army? And he's like, heck yeah. So he goes to Germany, joins the German army in World War I. And that gives him purpose and brotherhood, which is still something very commonly talked about like the benefits of joining any military, is you're surrounded by people who kind of like have to get along with you, and you're given a common purpose. World War I ends, and he loses his purpose again. So what he does is so World War I ends, and he is furious about his adopted country. He adopts Germany as his country. And he's furious about this embarrassment. So he joins a German political party with the goal of improving Germany and bringing honor back to Germany. That's his goal. So he joins this political party and immediately becomes the leader of it. Okay. Hitler is actually, funny enough, a crap politician. Like he's okay. Restart. He is an excellent politician, but his political ideas are crap. They're disorganized, they're confused, they're not unique, they make no sense. There's nothing he's saying in his speeches that's interesting, makes sense, or anything like that. However, as my college professor defined it, Hitler was a genius politician, a political genius, for 3 reasons. 1, he was an extremely powerful public speaker. If you watch videos of Hitler speaking, he is extremely powerful. You don't need to speak German to want to watch him talk. And that's the thing, is we don't understand what he's saying. His ideas were all confused, so people who spoke German also didn't understand what he's saying. But he was so good and was so good at making the audience feel something that people came to listen and people were loyal to him, and he could make a crowd angry or sad or feel whatever he wants. That's an extremely important quality in a politician. He was also a brilliant organizer. He pushes the party community rather than the politics. So for him, his political party is much more about, hey, come be a part of us, be a part of our movement, rather than get behind our politics. So he's kind of using that lack of purpose that he has struggled with his entire life to get other people to join. This is how people join cults. This is why cults are so successful. People join cults when they have a lack of purpose. And there's a lot of organizations that help people with a lack of purpose in a good way, like the military. And then there's people who do it badly, like the Nazis and cults. A part of doing this was through uniforms and armbands. You know, like people like to be a part of something. They like to wear a uniform that shows, like, this is my school or my college. This is my political party. I'm a part of this community. He was also an amazing publicist. He kind of was the cornerstone of the idea that no press is bad press, which is a side note of why you should research who you vote for. Basically, he wanted his political party and his name in the press no matter what. Like starting riots, violence, whatever. Get people saying the Nazi Party, get people saying Hitler's name. And then when people show up to the voting booth, they're more likely to vote for a name they've heard of. Even if they don't remember that, like, so if they've heard Nazi said a lot, they will show up in the booth and be like, oh, Nazi, I've heard of that. They may not remember that they've heard of it because it's terrible. They've just heard of it. So they're more likely to vote for it. That's why politicians during voting season have ads everywhere. You're more likely to vote for someone whose name you've heard of, even if you don't remember why. Which is why, before you vote, you should probably research. Okay, next slide. So Nazism and fascism. Nazism and fascism are two different forms of government, but are similar. They both only thrive in times of dysfunction, when people lack security. Basically, this is true for any extreme form of government. Extreme government only happens when there is instability. If a country is stable economically, politically, then it's not, extremism's not going to come in. But if people are unsure, they don't know what's going to happen, they're much more likely to vote more extreme. So fascism, as a definition, is a dictatorship that emphasizes nationalism, superiority of a specific ethnic group, so like white people or Asians or things like that. Or it might be even like more specific, like Japanese, Italians. But usually it does come down to like a race. And glorifies violence. Basically, like the government will like execute people and people will like come and like jeer at the execution. Nazism is kind of like a next level fascism, and kind of the difference, simplistically put, is that fascism can kind of apply to a lot of different governments. Like there have been a lot of fascist governments in history. Nazism is Germany and this time period specific. We can, well, dear gosh, I hope we never have another Nazi government. But like we really can't, because Nazism is essentially connected to Hitler. You can't have Nazism without Hitler. Anyway, that's a whole historical argument we can get into later. But so Nazism is a dictatorship that emphasizes German nationalism. You have to be German. Believes in anti-Semitism, which is being against Jews, and a desire to expand. Basically, Hitler was obsessed with conquering Europe. So, in summary, Nazism is the belief that Germans are the best and everything else is crap. Jews are the blame for everything, and Germans should control all of Europe. Okay, so Hitler's first failure is Hitler and the Nazi Party does attempt, sorry, just got an email, did attempt to take over the German government by force, but it was during an Indian summer in the economy. The term Indian summer means like a brief period of goodness, basically. So Okay, so like in the middle of winter, let's say we're in January and there's like a week where it's like 60 to 70 degrees out, it's sunny, everything's really nice. That's an Indian summer. It's a brief period of like sun and joy in an otherwise like cold winter. So an Indian summer in the economy means everything is crap, but for like a brief like year, things are good. So he didn't succeed because Nazism and fascism only succeed when things are terrible. So he tried to take it over through riot, basically, and he went to jail. He learned the really important lesson that you cannot take over an industrial society without a military. Like, people with guns are not going to be able to take on tanks. Like, a riot is not going to be an industrial army. It's just not. When he is in jail, he writes his book Mein Kampf, which is the cover to the right, which is terrifying. In it, he outlines why all of Germany's faults are the Jews. All of Germany's problems are the Jews' fault. There we go. That makes more sense. It's a sentence. Okay. So in his time in jail and during this Indian summer, he sets the groundwork for Nazi rule in two important ways. One, he establishes himself as the one and only ruler of the Nazi Party, which is what I meant earlier in that you can't separate Nazism from Hitler. These kind of extremist movements usually need a leader that people can like rally behind. So he's the one and only person in the Nazi Party. Their slogan becomes one person, one nation, one people, one nation, one leader. So one people, the German people, one nation, unifying Germany again under German control, one leader, Hitler. That's what the slogan in the poster at the bottom says. And you might see the middle word is Reich, which is German for nation. So if you've ever heard anything referred to as the Third Reich, that's the rise of the Nazi Party. The Third Reich is another way of saying it. Yeah, so fascist movements require a leader who is near God status, meaning whenever fascism, Nazism, or any kind of totalitarianism happens, it requires that there's a leader who people are utterly loyal to. It doesn't matter what that leader does, people will not fault them. And that's what Hitler became. He also embeds the Nazi Party into German culture, which was very clever, which feels weird to call Hitler clever. He basically sets up Nazi headquarters in every region, which serves two purposes. One, they serve basically as like community centers. So they have like organizations and like clubs in them. So like you want to go learn first aid, go to the Nazi headquarters. You want to have a knitting group, to the Nazi headquarters. And also, when Hitler takes over, those headquarters will become basically like state capitals. So, twofold purpose. Like I was saying, starts a bunch of Nazi organizations, like the Hitler Youth, sort of like the Boy Scouts, not quite like the Boy Scouts, but what he was doing with Hitler Youth is he was training these young boys to become soldiers in the German army. Because if you remember, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's not allowed to have a standing army. So, in this like kind of sneaky way, he's training thousands and thousands of soldiers through the guise of like a Boy Scout-like organization. It's not actually like the Boy Scouts, but that's how it was kind of advertised. And these organizations became so powerful that things like the Nazi Teacher Association, where it got to the point where you couldn't be a teacher if you weren't a part of the Nazi Teacher Association. Like people would ask you on your job application, are you a part of the Nazi T-shirt association? And if you weren't, you were not going to get hired. So he basically, the goal is to make the Nazi party interchangeable with German. Like, if you're German, you're also Nazi. If you're Nazi, you're German. His goal was to integrate it so fully into the community. The Great Depression makes everything even worse in the US or in Europe. So the Great Depression is something you'll talk about pretty in depth in US history. But it is this like horrendous thing where I think about 20% of people in the United States were homeless during the Great Depression. And it was even worse in Europe. Why? There was no infrastructure. Everything was destroyed in the war. So people were still trying to get their houses back. Everyone was still in massive debt. There was mass unemployment, factories stood still, and there was that whole inflation thing. So the pictures are from Germany. The right picture, that's like stacks of money that children are playing with, because that's how worthless the German money was, is that adults were like, yeah, go play with it. Like, it's not, it can be a toy, it doesn't matter. The left is a woman burning the money, because basically the money was so worthless that it was more cost effective for her to burn the money in her fire than it was for her to use the money to go buy firewood. It made more sense just to burn the money than use it to buy firewood. That's how bad things were. Here's a point that I would usually have asked you, but since I'm talking to myself right now, I'm gonna go ahead and just tell you. What is scapegoating? Scapegoating as a definition is blaming someone for a problem they had nothing to do with. The most famous example of scapegoating is my dog ate my homework. Basically, something's wrong. No one wants to take the blame that something's wrong. So they're like, okay, I'm going to go blame this person over here so that I don't have to deal with the consequences. You didn't do your homework? Don't want to tell your teacher you didn't do your homework. So my dog ate it? Is kind of the logic. Or a different example, oh, you're running late to go meet your friend for lunch. Be like, and it's totally your fault. You left 30 minutes late. You're like, oh, I'm so sorry. There was an earthquake and traffic on the way. That's scapegoating. You're blaming something else that had nothing to do with it. But usually it's a person, so that may not have been a good example. Anyway, you know what I mean. So Hitler in his campaign, so the video says this pretty clearly, Hitler was an elected official. People elected him. And one of his campaign promises was to punish the Jews. Hitler said Jews were the cause of the Great Depression. This comes from a stereotype around the fact that Jews historically in Europe controlled sources of money. This comes from the Middle Ages, where the Roman Catholic Church told Europeans and Christians that they weren't allowed to handle money, but there's nothing in Judaism that says you're not allowed to handle money. So working in banks and giving loans was the only job Jews were allowed to have. So that's where that stereotype of, like, if you've ever heard the stereotype of like, oh, Jews have all this money, they're all rich, blah, blah, blah. It comes from that. So since Jews are associated with money, Hitler was like, well, if we're struggling with money, it must be the Jews' fault. So he scapegoats the Jews. Rather than the German government taking responsibility for, making the economy suck by printing off all that money, instead Hitler's like, nope, it's not the government's fault, it's the Jews' fault. So Germans start believing Jews caused the Great Depression and caused their economic crisis. We're going to talk about this when we talk about the Holocaust in more depth. But basically, there's this huge propaganda campaign where Jews just start being blamed for everything. They're scapegoated not just for it starts with the economic problems, but then they're just scapegoated for literally any problem that could possibly happen. Like, if you remember when we talked about the Middle Ages and anti-Semitism, Jews were blamed for the plague. People believed in the Middle Ages Jews caused the plague. Like, that makes no sense. So that leads to the Holocaust, which again, we will talk about later. Okay, this is the final slide we're going to go over for this era. Again, the notes will be posted on Schoology. Let me know if you have any questions.